Part of the journey that we're on towards obtaining and achieving emotional health and having an emotionally healthy spirituality is accepting reality. Scazzero says in his book, Emotionally Healthy Spirituality is about reality. It's not denial or illusion. Or maybe to use a different word, and I think I already just used it actually, acceptance. We accept reality, the reality of our lives and the reality of who we are. We accept the reality of our circumstances. Reality, is what it is, and we can't, I was going to say we can't change it, but here's what I want to say. Acceptance doesn't mean that you like your circumstances and that there's nothing that you can do to change your circumstances. Sometimes there are things you can do to change your circumstances, right? But the key point that Scazzero's, making in this chapter is that we don't avoid, reality, or we're not in denial about the truth, about who we are and the circumstances of our lives and where we are and what we do and those sort of things. Again, we grow. That's the whole point. We are trying to change our circumstances by growing in emotional health and having an emotionally healthy spirituality. But we have to accept who we are. And another way to put it, as Scazzero puts it in the book, we accept our limits. And if you remember from last week, that on this journey of faith that we're on, we are bound to hit a wall, right? That something will happen in our lives that will halt our progress on this journey. Whether it's some loss, some crisis that we endure, or tragedy that happens, or some kind of big change that happens in our lives, we're not quite sure how to deal with those things, right? And God isn't making it easy for us. Perhaps unlike how we've experienced Him in the past, where we've experienced, maybe like an instantaneous transformation, or things seem to be easier. Well, this time, when you hit these circumstances, that God is actually waiting for you to partner with Him to move on and to see progress, to move ahead. It's not going to happen instantaneously or magically or anything like that. It's a work in progress. It's something that you have to choose to do. And as Scazzero puts in the book, usually the way forward, the way past the wall, if you want to get past that wall, is you take a journey inward. So, in fact, we're looking at ourselves today, a hard look at ourselves today, to see what it is about loss, what it is about our limits, those parts of us and those parts of our lives that, we don't particularly appreciate because we want to be more than we are. We want to have more than we have. All these sort of things. Let me give you a few examples. Scazzero actually lists several examples. Following areas are the areas in which we can think of ourselves and think of the gifts that we have, that we've perhaps naturally been given or have worked to achieve, or taken our natural talents or gifts and made them better or grown in them. But the reality is, and what we're going to see here is, what one person is gifted in, another person won't be gifted in. And no one person is gifted in every area. We all have limits. So he says, your physical body, not everyone is a model. Not everyone is, super attractive by, whatever standard you want to put upon people. The point is that not everyone looks the same, right? Not everyone has the same physical strength. Not everyone is tall. Sorry, not everyone's going to be an NBA basketball player, right? Not everyone is going to be athletic. But what some people don't have, others do have, right? Because maybe you're not athletic, but maybe you're very intelligent, right? We often see, that contrast in movies or TV or whatever it is, between, the jocks and the nerds. But that's a reality of people's different limits. Yes, one person might be gifted in athletics, but maybe they're not so smart. But maybe another person is very smart or very, book smart or intelligent, high IQ or whatever it is, and they're not so athletic. That this reality of our life, and each person might want to have what they don't have, right? But that's the reality of their limits, and by avoiding or trying to deny that you have limits isn't going to get you anywhere, and that's Scazzero's point here. Or what about the reality of your family of origin, who your parents were, right? And what your ethnicity is, or, I often didn't appreciate and to some degree still don't appreciate certain aspects of Italian culture that are reality. And, but I can't change my ethnicity. I am who I am as it relates to, my heritage in that way. So there's nothing I can do about that. That's a limit that I have to accept. And again, I'm sort of jumping ahead, but once you accept your limits, that's when you're able to move forward and say, okay, that is a reality about me now. And despite that, here's how I can move ahead. But the more you try to avoid, the more you deny, that halts your progress. There's different areas of your family of origin, whether it's a propensity towards abuse, a propensity towards alcoholism or addictions, right? Many different areas that we are not particularly happy that we have those limits placed upon us simply because of the family we were born into. What about, as an adult, your marital status? What if you want to get married, but you haven't yet gotten married? You haven't found the right person. Or if if you are married, that you're struggling to have children. These are challenges and these are limits that we often, in some ways we have control over, and in other ways we very much don't have control over. It could be very difficult, very challenging, and we often will want to try to deny the reality. Talents and gifts, and this is sort of piggybacking off of what I said earlier. Some of us have certain musical ability while others don't. All right, I'm happy that I'm a drummer and I have the ability to play at least some guitar and bass and that sort of thing. But I'm not a singer. You don't really, I can maybe hear the difference between good and bad vocals, but I don't really have the capability of singing in any particularly great way. So that's a limit on me, right? And my personality is what it is. I'm an agreeable person. I'm an open person. However, that doesn't always work when you are trying to work on the more management side of things. It might work better for creative endeavors, but in terms of planning and managing and all these sort of things, that's a challenge for me, right? And that's a limit that I have. I have to work with that. I can't deny it, because if I do, I'll sort of be stuck. Our time, places, we can only do so much in a day. We can only do so much, get this, in a lifetime. So our time places limits upon us, and we have to, deal with that. Our work and relationship realities, that's a limit in a sense. If you want to have a job, a career, and have a family, then you have to make certain concessions. You have to make certain, you have to figure out how those things can coexist, because often you can't put 100% of yourself into each of them at the same time. That's a limit, and you have to accept that, embrace that. And lastly, what he lists here is, he also mentions material wealth, right? And that's, obviously we would all like to have more money or more, material resources so that we can do what we want to do in life or worry less or whatever it is. But we have limits, when it comes to that. And again, there are things we can do to help those limits, but I don't know if I'll ever be a billionaire, right? So that might just have to be a limit that I'm going to have to accept. And lastly, he lists your spiritual understanding. And that's just a reality. Some people just simply do not have within them a natural ability to understand spiritual matters or be inclined towards spiritual matters. And that doesn't mean that God doesn't love them, and it doesn't mean that they can't have faith. It just means that some people are more, inclined towards, let's say, studying the Bible and being a spiritual person, and some people are more, what would you say, like in this world, and just a lot less abstract than perhaps others. The point is this, right? We are different people, and we have different circumstances, both in terms of the reality of our lives and who we are and where we are in our lives, but also in terms of who we are on the inside and our personalities and our genetics and whatever it is, right? So we each have limits, and that can be painful and tough to say that we have limits, but in reality, it's a good thing because it keeps us humble. And being humble means that you stay grounded. According to Scazzero, that's actually the root word, the root of the word humility in Latin, at least, is to be grounded, is to say, I'm not up here. I'm not, high and mighty. I'm down here and I'm looking up. And what that means is you're more prone to, you're more able to learn and grow and be open to God when you are in a state of humility. Of course, though, we often try to avoid reality, and we often try to avoid accepting our limits. And in fact, the Apostle Paul mentions in 2 Corinthians that he had some sort of thorn in the flesh. He doesn't exactly explain what he means by that, what he was actually referring to. I guess the metaphor is having a thorn in the flesh is something that, it stings and it's annoying and it's painful. But he doesn't say what he's actually referring to. Lots of different theories, but nevertheless. But it says in verse 7 that this thorn in the flesh was there to keep him from becoming proud. And that's, I'm guessing, what he concluded after the fact, because he then said in the next verse that 3 different times I begged the Lord to take it away. So he begged the Lord to take this thorn in the flesh away, indicating he didn't want it. He tried to avoid this, pain that he had, and we do that often when we endeavor to, avoid reality, avoid accepting our limits. We say, take this away, instead of accepting the reality of it. In fact, here are several ways that we avoid reality. We hit that wall, right? And that halts our progress on our spiritual journey. And what are we doing? We're avoiding the reality of who we are and what we are. And we are really good at avoiding reality. We have these ways of what Scazzero calls defense mechanisms, different things that we do to avoid reality. He says that we deny reality. We selectively forget reality, and we try to minimize reality, right? We try to say, oh, it's not so bad. Oh, well, it's okay, right? Or we blame others and say, it's not my fault. It's this person, right? It's because of what they did. Or in a different way, you blame yourself, and what somebody actually is responsible for, you blame yourself. And none of this is helping you get to the reality of the situation. You're either passing the blame to someone else, or you're wrongly putting the blame on yourself. we try to rationalize, we try to intellectualize. We say, oh, but there's certain reasons why this person is the way they are, or there's certain reasons why I am the way that I am, right? You blame science or genetics or nature or whatever. Or here, how about this one? You distract yourself, right? We will often, that's a huge one. That's one where which I'm able to admit that's one that I do. I distract myself with food, or other people distract themselves with other kinds of self-medication, right? That's a term that refers to the fact that we sort of medicate ourselves. It's in some sense literally, but in another sense it's a metaphor for saying we're sort of medicating ourselves so that we can be numb to reality, so that we're not actually experiencing reality. Instead, we get the dopamine hit of whatever we're doing, and we just experience that good feeling. And I think sometimes when we don't do that, we become hostile. And that's yet another defense mechanism, right? We're saying, well, I don't want to face reality. You almost get angry, but not in a good way that gets you to the truth, but in a way that keeps you away from it. So these are different, parts of our lives that, aspects of what we do that enables us to avoid reality. So how can we accept reality? How can we accept our limits? Avoiding our limits doesn't get us anywhere good. We have to accept them. And Scazzero likens accepting our limits to grief. Why does he say that grief is kind of like how we, what we do when we grieve is what we need to do when we accept our limits? He puts it that way, and he does that because really our limits are like a loss. It's a loss of an expectation that we have, loss of a hope that we had. So we have to grieve over that loss. We can't be everything that we want to be. We can't have everything we want to have. Again, we can work towards things, we can grow. I'm not saying that we can't work towards certain goals. Of course, that's what we're doing. But we have to accept our limits and be honest with ourselves. So Scazzero lists the following 3 steps that we can do to help accept our limits. Firstly, pay attention. That is to not to fall into those defense mechanism traps, but instead we pay attention to what's happening, pay attention to what we're doing, and where our limits are. Unless we're being mindful and observant of what's happening in our lives, we're just going to continue to avoid. But secondly, we wait in what he calls the confusing in between. While we're trying to figure out what our limits are and how we can move on despite those limits, there's going to be a frustrating time in between that we have to sort of wait and partner with God. And so that develops in us patience, but patience is not easy, right? And lastly, he says, embrace the gift of limits. Because here's the truth. When you know what your limits are, you're then able to, work within that, work despite it. You focus on where perhaps you're less limited, and you excel at that. And you accept who you are and who God wants you to be, right? And it reminds me again of what Paul's got as a response to his prayer. He asked for the thorn in the flesh to be taken away, and his response that he got was, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness." So humility is good because it helps us to be in the position that we need to be in order to be what God wants us to be and to grow into that. So finally, this is all summed up in, again, staying humble, and this is our path to humility. Scazzero proposes several things, and I'm just going to give you a few of them here. Several things that we can do to pursue humility, and it's an ongoing process. It's a daily pursuit of humility. He says, be mindful of God. Don't forget that God is watching over us, and we don't want to think of that in a creepy, sort of authoritarian type way. It just means understand that God's presence is always with us, and that we can always rely on him and grow in him. And it's, we're not in this alone, is perhaps a better way of thinking of it. And that should be a good motivating truth instead of something negative. Focus on doing God's will, right? Focus on doing God's will. And what he means by that is, don't focus on what others expect of you. Don't even focus on what you might expect of yourself in a purely, narrow sense. But focus on what God wants for you and what God has for you, and then, live within that. Thirdly, he said, be radically honest to others about your weaknesses and your faults. Boy, if there's anything that will keep you humble, it's being honest to others about your weaknesses and faults. Don't try to be someone you're not, and instead be honest with others as it relates to perhaps what your limits are. You be honest, and then suddenly you're beginning to own them, you're beginning to embrace them, and you're remaining humble as a result. But along those lines, we are also patient. He says, be patient with others, because they're on their own journey. At the very least, the people that who are fellow believers and are indeed on their own journey. But even if they are, non-believers or whatever, people who are not necessarily on a spiritual path, but you know what? They might be one day, or even if they're not, they're on a journey of life at least. So be patient with them, because they, in the same way that we need grace, we can show them grace, right? And lastly, the one that I picked out here is purposefully speak less. So speak less on purpose, right? And why would that be, something that helps us with humility? Because maybe not everything that you have to say is very important, right? Maybe not everything that you have to say is helpful. And that's tough, and it's actually especially tough for me, because I like to think out loud. I like to talk. I like to talk for a living, actually. So it's something that I have to purposely do. Is instead of, I do this with my wife quite often. I don't always succeed, but I often want to say something, but I know that it will add nothing to the conversation and nothing to help her. So I purposefully speak less. And there's more that we can do to stay humble and to grow in humility, but that's a great start. And in this place of humility, I think we will see God doing amazing things in and through us, powerfully working in us. James said, humble yourselves before the Lord and he will lift you up in honor. And that's just so encouraging, because that means that the more we do the things that we've discussed in today's message, and we stay grounded and humble, and we accept our limits and accept who we are, God will do amazing things with us. So that's where I want to be, and I hope you'll join me and join us on this journey towards emotionally healthy spirituality. And this is we make it past the wall. We have this journey inward. And it brings us to a place of humility and acceptance. So that's exciting. Hope you'll join us.